Every muscle in my body ached as I hunched over the keyboard, the fluorescent lights of Moretti Industries casting harsh shadows across the endless stack of paperwork that had become my entire existence. I could still taste the metallic tang of blood on my tongue from where I'd bitten down to keep from crying out earlier, after Evan's latest explosion left me with a bruised rib that protested with every single breath I took. The familiar weight of concealer felt heavy beneath my eyes, carefully applied to hide the dark purple shadows that had absolutely nothing to do with a lack of sleep and everything to do with the man I'd so foolishly thought loved me. The rich scent of expensive coffee and fine leather permeated the 23rd floor of the sleek Manhattan high-rise, a stark contrast to the cheap, instant coffee I could barely afford in my cramped studio apartment. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed, partly from sheer exhaustion and partly from the constant state of hypervigilance that had become my new normal. Every sound in the corridor made me jump. Every single voice that carried through the glass walls of the executive offices sent my pulse racing. Not because I feared my boss, mind you. Joseph Moretti was demanding, sure, but ultimately fair. It was because fear had simply become my default setting. I pressed my palm against my ribs where the pain flared with each shallow breath. Evan had been particularly violent the previous night after I'd mentioned having to work late again. He absolutely hated it when I stayed at the office past 6, claiming I was trying to attract attention from other men. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me, not in the slightest. I went so far out of my way to remain completely invisible, to blend into the beige walls and polished marble floors like a ghost haunting the corridors of corporate power. The elevator chimed softly, and I heard the familiar, telltale sound of expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble. Mr. Moretti always arrived at precisely 8:30, his routine as precise as everything else about him. I'd been his secretary for 8 long months now, and in that time, I'd learned to read his moods by the weight of his footsteps. Today, they sounded heavier than usual, purposeful in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Good morning, Julia." His voice was smooth, cultured, with just the slightest hint of an accent that spoke of old money and even older traditions. I looked up from my computer screen, forcing what I truly hoped was a professional smile, despite the way my lip pulled at the small cut Evan's ring had left there. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti. Your 9 o'clock appointment with the Carroll Group has been moved to 10:30 at their request. The contracts you asked for are on your desk, and the quarterly reports from the Chicago office arrived this morning." My voice sounded so much steadier than I actually felt. A small victory in a life that had somehow become a long series of small defeats. He paused beside my desk, and I caught a whiff of his cologne. Something expensive and undeniably masculine that made me think of safety, though I really couldn't explain why. When I dared to glance up at him, his dark eyes were studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. There was definitely something different about his expression that day. A sharpness that went far beyond his usual professional scrutiny. "You look tired," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made my chest feel tight. Not criticism, but concern. I wasn't particularly used to concern from anyone. "I'm fine, sir. Just a busy week." The lie came easily now, as practiced as my daily concealer routine. I'd become an expert at fine, at managing expectations, at making myself small enough that no one would ever look too closely. But Joseph Moretti was most definitely looking closely. His gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer than was professionally appropriate, and I saw something flicker in his expression, a darkness that had nothing to do with displeasure and everything to do with recognition. He'd built an empire on reading people, on seeing the things they tried so hard to hide. I should have known that my carefully constructed facade wouldn't fool him forever. "I'll be in meetings for most of the day," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Hold my calls unless it's absolutely urgent." I nodded, already turning back to my computer screen. But I could still feel his presence lingering in the air. When I finally heard his office door close with a soft click, I allowed myself to slump slightly in my chair, my ribs protesting the sudden movement. The morning stretched ahead of me like a minefield. Documents to type, calls to field, the constant, unwavering effort of pretending that my life wasn't slowly disintegrating all around me. By lunchtime, The pain in my side had intensified to the point where I could barely concentrate. I'd skipped breakfast again, not from any kind of eating disorder, but because buying groceries meant less money for the increasing demands Evan made on my meager paycheck. He'd started taking my debit card more frequently, claiming he desperately needed it for job interviews, though I secretly suspected the money was going toward the bottles that seemed to multiply in our apartment like some sort of plague. I was reaching for a file in the bottom drawer when the movement sent a sharp spike of agony through my torso. The gasp that involuntarily escaped my lips was immediate, and I pressed my hand to my side, closing my eyes against the wave of dizziness that followed. Julia! I hadn't even heard him approach, but when I opened my eyes, Mr. Moretti was standing right beside my desk, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. There was something inherently dangerous in his stillness, a predatory quality that really should have frightened me, but somehow didn't. "I'm fine," I said automatically, trying my best to straighten in my chair. "I just moved a little too quickly." His eyes dropped to where my hand was pressed against my ribs, and I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Stand up." It wasn't a request. The authority in his tone was absolutely absolute, the kind of command that brooked no argument whatsoever. I rose slowly, fighting another wave of dizziness, and his gaze tracked every minute movement, every wince I couldn't quite suppress. "Lift your shirt." The words hit me like a physical blow to the gut. "Sir, Now." There was absolutely no room for argument in that single syllable. No space for the protest that died on my lips. With shaking hands, I raised the hem of my blouse just enough to reveal the angry purple-black bruise that stretched across my ribs like some sort of abstract painting done in pain. The silence that followed was deafening, almost unbearable. I watched Joseph's face transform right before my very eyes, watched something cold and terrible settle in his features. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a brief moment I caught a glimpse of the man beneath the polished businessman. Someone fully capable of violence that would make Evan's petty cruelties look like mere child's play. "Who did this to you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout ever could. I lowered my shirt with shaking hands, unable to meet his intense eyes. I fell down the stairs. "I'm clumsy." "Don't." The single word cut through my flimsy explanation like a razor-sharp blade. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies." The tears I'd been holding back for weeks suddenly threatened to spill over and pour down my face. In the 8 long months of working for him, Joseph had never been anything but completely professional. But there was something in his voice now that spoke of protection, of a man who had just witnessed something that offended him on a fundamental level. "It's not your concern, Mr. Moretti," I managed to choke out, wrapping my arms tightly around myself as if I could somehow hold the shattered pieces of my dignity together through sheer force of will. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks dancing in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne mingled with something far more primal. Anger barely leashed and entirely focused on my behalf. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You are very much my concern." Before I could fully process what he meant, what the actual implications of that statement might be, his phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the mounting tension like a knife, and I reached for it automatically, eternally grateful for the interruption. "Moretti Industries, Mr. Moretti's office." "Is he there?" The voice was gruff, impatient. "This is Detective Martinez. We need to speak with him about the genetic investigation." I looked up at Mr. Moretti, whose expression had shifted into something completely unreadable. He held out his hand for the phone, and I passed it to him, trying desperately not to think about how his fingers brushed against mine or the way that simple contact sent a jolt of unexpected warmth shooting up my arm. "Detective," he said smoothly, but I still caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "What can I do for you?" As he spoke, I tried my very best to focus on the computer screen, on absolutely anything other than the conversation taking place mere feet from my desk, but I really couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in those few minutes, that the careful balance I'd so painstakingly maintained for months was about to crumble entirely. When he hung up, Mr. Moretti's attention immediately returned to me with laser-like focus. "I have to go out for a few hours." When I get back, we're gonna have a conversation. It wasn't a suggestion, and I nodded mutely, already dreading whatever that conversation might possibly entail. As he gathered his coat and briefcase, I caught him looking at me one more time, and there was something in his expression that made my heart race for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. "Julia," he said from the doorway, his voice soft, but carrying an unmistakable promise. "This isn't over." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet office, my hand unconsciously drifting to my now throbbing, bruised ribs. For the very first time in months, I felt something other than pure resignation settling in my chest. It might have been hope or it might have been terror. In my world, they'd become almost indistinguishable from one another. The rest of the afternoon passed in a complete haze of nervous energy and steadily mounting dread. Every single time the elevator chimed, my heart jumped, thinking Mr. Moretti had finally returned. Every single phone call made me wonder if it was Evan checking up on me with that particular brand of paranoia that had intensified so much over the past few weeks. The bruise on my ribs throbbed in perfect rhythm with my pulse, a constant and painful reminder of the previous night's violence and the undoubtedly difficult conversation that awaited me. At exactly 5:30, I began methodically shutting down my computer and organizing my desk for the next day, the familiar routine providing a small measure of much-needed comfort. Most of the other administrative staff had already left for the day, their voices and laughter fading as they headed off to happy hours and fancy dinner dates, normal lives that seemed as foreign to me as life on another planet. I envied them their complete freedom, their ability to actually look forward to the evening instead of dreading what undoubtedly waited for me back at home. I was gathering my purse when I heard the distinctive sound of Mr. Moretti's footsteps in the corridor. My movements stilled immediately, and I felt that familiar tension coil tightly in my stomach. Through the clear glass walls of his office, I could see him approaching, his expression completely unreadable, but undeniably purposeful. He wasn't alone. Two men in expensive suits flanked him on either side, their posture and demeanor suggesting they were more than just simple business associates. "Julia." His voice carried that same quiet authority from earlier, and I straightened automatically. "Please come into my office." It wasn't a request, and I followed him on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of the two imposing men who remained in the outer office, but whose palpable presence felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. Mr. Moretti closed the door behind us with a soft click that somehow felt final, and I found myself utterly alone with him in the space that had always felt so incredibly safe before. His office was a meticulous study in understated power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city, dark wood furniture that spoke of old money, and stunning artwork that I secretly suspected was worth more than I made in an entire year. But that particular night, it felt completely different. There was an undeniable energy in the room that made my skin prickle with awareness, a distinct sense that whatever conversation we were about to have would inevitably change everything. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the plush leather chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. I perched on the very edge of the seat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, and watched as he moved around to lean casually against the front of his desk. The seemingly relaxed position put him much closer to me than was strictly professional. Close enough that I could clearly see the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he carefully studied my face. "Tell me about him," he said without preamble. "The man who put his hands on you." The sheer directness of the question sent a flush of shame rushing through me, hot and acidic. "Mr. Moretti, I truly appreciate your concern, but this really isn't his name." The words cut through my desperate deflection like a blade, and there was something decidedly dangerous in his tone that spoke of barely controlled violence. "Give me his name." I simply stared at him, taking in the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk, the rigid set of his broad shoulders beneath his expensive suit. There was absolutely nothing soft about Joseph Moretti in that particular moment, nothing at all that suggested the civilized businessman who signed my paychecks. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous in ways I was only just beginning to fully understand. "Evan?" I whispered, the name feeling like a deep betrayal on my lips. "Evan Mitchell." He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement that somehow felt like a final verdict being passed down. How long? 6 months. The words came out small and broken, and I hated myself for the obvious weakness they revealed. It wasn't always like this. He was completely different in the beginning. They always are. His voice carried a distinct weight of knowledge that made me look at him more closely. There was something in his guarded expression that spoke of first-hand experience with violence, with the particular kinds of men who inexplicably hurt women. Where does he work? The questions kept coming, each one delivered with the same quiet intensity, and I found myself inexplicably answering despite every single instinct that screamed at me to remain absolutely silent. He carefully pulled details from me with surgical precision. Evan's workplace, his daily schedule, his established habits, even the disturbing patterns of his escalating violence. With each damning revelation, I watched something harden in Mr. Moretti's features, something cold and implacable settling over him like an impenetrable suit of armor. Why haven't you left him? The pointed question was surprisingly gentler than the others, but it still hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Where would I go? The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Months of pent-up, trapped desperation finally finding its voice. He knows where I work, where my mother lives. He's threatened to find me if I leave, and I actually believe him. I stopped abruptly, unable to voice the rest of it. The way Evan's irrational jealousy had slowly grown into something truly monstrous. The way he'd ominously started talking about making absolutely sure no other man would ever want me. Mr. Moretti was quiet for what felt like a very long moment. And when he finally spoke, his voice was almost deadly soft. He's what, Julia? I finally met his intense eyes, seeing something there that really should have terrified me, but instead made me feel safer than I had felt in months. He's sick in ways that go far beyond just hitting me. He talks about permanent solutions, about making absolutely sure I can never leave him. The tense silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. I watched as Mr. Moretti straightened, his movements now predatory and almost precise, and I caught a fleeting glimpse of the man he must have been long before the expensive suits and manufactured corporate respectability. Someone who understood the true nature of violence intimately, someone who could undoubtedly wield it with the same cold precision he effortlessly brought to his complex business dealings. That's not going to happen, he said quietly, and there was such absolute certainty in his voice that I almost believed him without question. Not while you're under my protection. The simple words really should have confused me, should have raised so many obvious questions about why my powerful boss was suddenly involving himself so deeply in my extremely personal life. Instead, they sent a wave of unexpected relief rushing through me, so powerful it was almost painful. For the first time in months, someone was genuinely offering to stand protectively between me and the growing threat that had slowly become my entire life. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. He moved then, coming around the desk to crouch directly in front of my chair, bringing himself to my eye level. The seemingly simple gesture was unexpectedly gentle, but there was nothing at all soft about the unwavering intensity burning in his dark eyes. This isn't about what you're asking for, Julia. This is solely about what I'm choosing to give. His unnerving proximity was almost overwhelming. The intoxicating scent of his cologne, the way his impeccably tailored suit pulled tautly across his broad shoulders, the subtle calluses on his surprisingly rough hands that spoke of a past that was clearly very different from his carefully cultivated current corporate image. There was definitely something about Joseph Moretti that called to a deeply buried part of me I'd almost forgotten even existed, the part that had once wholeheartedly believed in actual protection and real safety and in the kind of honorable men who kept their sacred promises. Why? The question slipped out before I could even stop it, and I saw something flicker quickly across his guarded features. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe even recognition. Because some things simply shouldn't be tolerated, he said simply. And because you undoubtedly deserve far better than to live in constant fear. Before I could even respond to his words, there was a soft knock on the door. One of the men from the outer office entered without waiting for formal permission, his professional expression respectful but still urgent. Sir, we have the information you requested. Mr. Moretti rose smoothly, his entire demeanor instantly shifting back into that of the powerful businessman I knew all too well, but I still caught the way his hands flexed almost imperceptibly at his sides, the subtle tension that suggested barely leashed action. "Evan Mitchell," the man continued, consulting a small notepad in his hand. "Works the night shift at Morrison's warehouse on the west side. Gets off promptly at 7 a.m. Usually stops at the Riverside Diner for a cup of coffee before heading back home to his apartment on Lexington Street." I felt the blood drain completely from my face as I realized they'd been actively watching him, gathering detailed intelligence with the kind of ruthless efficiency that spoke of resources far beyond what any legitimate businessman should even possess. The final pieces of a complex puzzle I hadn't even known I was subconsciously solving clicked ominously into place. The deferential difference his employees obviously showed him, the way certain prominent clients spoke to him with a carefully calculated mixture of both respect and fear, the undeniable fact that Detective Martinez had personally called him about some sort of ongoing investigation. "Thank you, Marco." Mr. Moretti's voice was remarkably steady, but I still caught the subtle undercurrent of something undeniably darker. "That will be all for now." After the man quickly left the room, the heavy silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken implications. I just stared at Mr. Moretti, finally seeing him clearly for perhaps the very first time, fully understanding that the man who so casually signed my paychecks was indeed capable of things that existed far outside the accepted boundaries of strict corporate law. "You're not just a businessman," I said quietly, and it definitely wasn't a question. He met my gaze steadily, and there was absolutely no attempt at denial in his expression. "No, I'm most certainly not. Should I be afraid of you?" The loaded question hung precariously in the air between us, and I watched as something shifted almost imperceptibly in his features, something undeniably vulnerable briefly appearing beneath the carefully controlled exterior. "I would never intentionally hurt you, Julia," he said, and there was such unwavering sincerity in his low voice that I actually believed him without question. "But I absolutely cannot say the very same about others who threaten what's rightfully mine." The possessive note in his deliberate voice really should have alarmed me, should have sent me running as fast as I possibly could toward the nearest unlocked door. Instead, it sent an unexpected wave of much-needed warmth spreading rapidly through my chest, a comforting feeling I hadn't experienced in so very long. I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be genuinely wanted rather than simply tolerated. "I should probably go home," I said, even though the hollow words felt undeniably false. Home just wasn't home for me anymore. It was simply a brutal battlefield where I was always tragically losing. "No." The word was undeniably gentle but absolutely absolute. "You should immediately go to your apartment, carefully pack what you truly need, and then you should disappear for a while." "I can't just disappear like that. I have important work responsibilities to take care of." "You have accrued vacation days," he interrupted smoothly. "Consider this an extended break with full pay, of course." The undeniably careful way he carefully phrased his unusual offer immediately told me this wasn't really a choice, that the genuine concern in his voice was ultimately backed by the kind of inherent authority that didn't generally accept any kind of arguments. Part of me desperately wanted to protest, to forcefully insist on bravely handling my own problems, but a much larger, more vulnerable part of me was undeniably grateful that someone was finally offering me a viable way out of the endless cycle of fear and senseless violence. Where would I even go? Something that might have been actual satisfaction flickered momentarily across his shadowed features. "Leave that entirely to me." The luxurious hotel room Mr. Moretti had thoughtfully arranged for me was genuinely nothing like what I'd been nervously expecting. Instead of some seedy, run-down motel on the outskirts of town, I found myself inexplicably standing in a stunning suite at the Meridian, one of Manhattan's most undeniably exclusive hotels. The marble bathroom was significantly larger than my entire cramped apartment, and the breathtaking view from the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering expanse of Central Park spread out far below like a captivating tapestry of mesmerizing lights and shadows. I stood transfixed at those very windows now, silently watching the ceaseless city move and breathe beneath me, while my mind endlessly raced with a barrage of overwhelming questions I wasn't even sure I truly wanted definitively answered. It had been 18 very long hours since Mr. Moretti's stern men had escorted me to hastily pack a single bag of my meager belongings, 18 hours since I'd nervously sent a quick text to Evan claiming I was visiting my sick aunt in distant Philadelphia. The obvious lie came far too easily to my lips. I'd sadly become an expert at skillful deception over the brutal past 6 months. But the overwhelming guilt that usually accompanied such calculated untruths was noticeably, and perhaps even disturbingly, absent. The unexpected knock on the door made me jump despite fully expecting it. Mr. Moretti had told me earlier that he would undoubtedly come by to check on me, to formally discuss the carefully planned next steps, though I privately suspected the impending conversation would be far more complicated and complex than those deceptively simple words could even begin to imply. I cautiously opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, looking as impeccably dressed as always, but somehow undeniably different in this far more intimate setting. "May I come in?" His low voice carried that same studied politeness, but there was something in his dark eyes that clearly suggested the unexpected formality was solely for my particular benefit rather than any real uncertainty about my ultimate answer. I silently stepped aside, hyper-aware of the precise way he deliberately moved into the space, how his overwhelming presence seemed to fill the utterly elegant room with a very palpable kind of tightly controlled energy. He was currently carrying a large manila envelope and a small paper bag that smelled deliciously of fresh pastries. A surprisingly thoughtful gesture that was unexpectedly touching given the current difficult circumstances. "You really need to eat something," he said quietly, setting the fragrant bag on the marble-top table near the expansive window. "You're far too thin." The casual observation was delivered matter-of-factly without even a hint of judgment, but it still highlighted how closely and carefully he'd obviously been watching me. The unnerving realization really should have made me increasingly uncomfortable, but instead it inexplicably filled me with a very unexpected warmth I didn't particularly want to examine too closely. When was undeniably the last time someone had genuinely noticed that I was slowly losing weight? That the constant stress and overwhelming fear had been slowly eating away at me both physically and emotionally? "Thank you," I said softly, gratefully accepting the steaming cup of coffee he kindly offered me. The distinctive cup was undeniably from that quaint little Italian place down the street from the office, the one where a single cappuccino cost more than I usually spent on my entire lunch. "You really didn't have to." "Yes, Julia, I most certainly did." He settled gracefully into the comfortable chair across from me, his posture deceptively relaxed, but his knowing eyes still incredibly sharp. "We definitely need to talk about what exactly happened last night." My trembling hands stilled on the delicate coffee cup. "What about last night, Mr. Moretti? What about Evan Mitchell?" He smoothly opened the manila envelope and withdrew a single. He slid the photograph across the table toward me, stating flatly, "He won't be bothering you anymore." The image was grainy, clearly taken from a security camera, but I immediately recognized Evan's profile. He was getting into his car outside the warehouse where he worked, the timestamp indicating it was taken at 7:23 a.m., just hours after I had disappeared. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made my stomach clench with a mixture of relief and stark terror. "Where is he?" I asked, though a part of me already dreaded the answer. "Gone." Mr. Moretti's voice was calm, almost detached, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a man's disappearance. Permanently. The word hung between us, heavy with implications I wasn't quite ready to confront. I stared at the photograph, at Evan's all-too-familiar face, bracing myself for the wave of horror that I thought should overwhelm me. Instead, what I felt was an overwhelming sense of relief, so powerful it made me feel momentarily weightless, almost dizzy. The constant fear that had become my unwanted companion, the ever-present dread that had colored every moment of every day, all of it simply vanished, leaving behind a lightness I had almost forgotten was even possible. "You killed him." It wasn't a question, and I was surprised by the steadiness of my voice when I spoke the words. "I protected you." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense and unwavering. "There's a difference, is there?" I met his eyes, seeing no remorse there, no flicker of guilt or uncertainty, just the unnerving calm satisfaction of a problem solved, a threat effectively eliminated. In the eyes of the law, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a grim acknowledgement. "The law would have required you to file charges, to testify, to relive every agonizing moment of his abuse in front of complete strangers. The law would have given him bail, opportunities to find you, to make good on his threats. The law would have failed you, Julia, just like it so often fails women in your situation. The brutal honesty of his words hit me with the force of a physical blow, partly because I recognized the undeniable truth in them. How many times had I considered calling the police, only to remember the countless stories of women who had tried that route, only to be let down by the system? How many restraining orders were simply meaningless pieces of paper to men like Evan, men who saw violence as their inherent right and twisted possession into something they dared to call love? What if you're wrong? I asked, though the question felt hollow, almost rhetorical. What if he could have changed? Men like him don't change. His voice carried a weight of experience, a weariness that made me shiver. They escalate. They find new and inventive ways to inflict pain, new threats to make. He would have killed you eventually, Julia. I simply saved us both the time. The casual way he said it, the unnerving certainty in his tone, should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself thinking about the oppressive fear that had become my constant companion. The way I had started avoiding mirrors because I couldn't bear to see what Evan's violence was turning me into. For the first time in months, I felt like I could take a full, deep breath without wincing, could sit without instinctively calculating the location of the nearest exit. Who are you? The question came out softer than I had intended, carrying more vulnerability than I had meant to reveal. Really? He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something subtle shift in his expression, as if he were carefully weighing how much of the truth I could handle. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a formality, a deliberate cadence that suggested he was sharing information he rarely disclosed. My family has been in the import business for 3 generations, he said carefully, choosing his words with precision. We specialize in ensuring that valuable items reach their intended destinations safely, regardless of the obstacles that might arise. The euphemisms were elegant, almost poetic, but I understood what he wasn't explicitly stating. The Moretti family wasn't just in the import business. They were in the control business, the power business, the kind of enterprise that operated in the shadowy spaces between legal and illegal, where most people feared to tread. And I work for you. Another piece of the puzzle clicking neatly into place. You work for my legitimate business interests? He corrected gently, his tone suggesting that he wouldn't tolerate any misinterpretations. Moretti Industries is exactly what it appears to be. A successful import company with offices in 6 countries and a well-deserved reputation for discretion and efficiency. But it's not all you do. No, he admitted, his gaze unwavering. It's not all I do. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken truths, and I found myself studying his face, searching for signs of the violence I now knew he was capable of. But all I saw was the same careful attention he had always shown me, the quiet consideration that had made working for him such a welcome relief after the sheer chaos that had become my personal life. Are you afraid of me now? He asked quietly, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question, a surprising hint of uncertainty. I considered it seriously, examining my feelings with the same meticulous care I had once used to navigate Evan's unpredictable moods. The logical part of my mind insisted that I should be terrified, that I should be meticulously planning my escape from this elegant room and the dangerous man who had orchestrated my stay here. But the emotional truth was far more complicated, a tangled web of conflicting feelings. No, I said finally, surprised by my own unflinching honesty. I should be, but I'm not. Why? The question was deceptively simple, but the answer was anything but. I thought about the way he had looked at my bruises, the barely controlled fury in his voice when he had demanded Evan's name. I thought about the careful way he had arranged my escape, the genuine concern in his voice when he had insisted that I needed to eat something. Because you could have hurt me months ago if that was your intention, I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. Because you've been nothing but respectful, even when you had every opportunity to take advantage. Because when you found out someone was hurting me, your first instinct was to protect me, not to exploit my vulnerability for your own benefit. Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that subtly transformed his features from merely handsome to something approaching breathtaking. It was the first time I had seen him without the carefully constructed mask of professional distance, and the effect was startling, almost disarming. "You're remarkable," he said softly, the words carrying genuine weight, and there was such sincerity in his voice that it made my chest tighten with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. "Most people in your situation would be looking for the nearest exit. Most people in my situation don't have anywhere to go." The words came out more bitter than I had intended, carrying the accumulated weight of months of trapped desperation. "Most people in my situation don't have someone powerful enough to make the monsters disappear. Is that what you think I am?" His voice was carefully neutral, but I caught something else underneath, something fleeting and difficult to identify. Hope, perhaps? Or maybe just the quiet need for reassurance. Someone powerful enough to keep the monsters away? I met his gaze, seeing past the expensive suit and the cultured voice to the man beneath. There was darkness there, certainly the undeniable capacity for violence that I had witnessed firsthand. But there was also protection, the kind of strength that could be wielded as a shield rather than a weapon. "I think you're someone who decides what he wants and then makes it happen," I said carefully, choosing my words with deliberate precision. "The question is, what do you want from me?" The slow smile that crossed his features was almost predatory, but somehow it didn't frighten me. Instead, it sent a shiver of heat spiraling through my chest, a warmth that had absolutely nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the intense way he was looking at me, as if I were something precious rather than irrevocably broken. "I want you safe," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "Everything else is negotiable." 3 days passed in the almost surreal luxury of the Meridian Suite. 3 days of room service meals that I didn't have to cook myself and undisturbed sleep that wasn't constantly interrupted by the sound of Evan's key in the lock. I found myself sleeping through the entire night for the first time in months, waking naturally instead of to the sound of angry voices or the shattering of bottles against walls. The absence of fear was almost disorienting, like learning to walk again after suffering from an injury I hadn't even fully realized was so debilitating. Mr. Moretti visited each evening, bringing carefully curated news from the outside world and carefully neutral updates about the ongoing search for Evan Mitchell. The police had officially classified him as a missing person, but there was little real urgency in their investigation. Men like Evan disappeared all the time in a sprawling city like New York, and without any concrete evidence of foul play, his case would likely fade into the background, overshadowed by more pressing concerns. "The lease on your apartment expires at the end of the month," he said during his Thursday evening visit, settling into the chair across from me with the effortless ease of someone who truly belonged in such elegant surroundings. "I took the liberty of having my people pack your belongings." I looked up from the book I had been pretending to read, a generic thriller whose fictional violence suddenly seemed almost tame compared to my current reality. "Where will you put them?" "That depends entirely on you." He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intent and unreadable. "I have a proposition." The word sent a strange flutter of something through my chest, a complex mix of anticipation and the unsettling recognition that whatever he was about to offer would inevitably change everything irrevocably. I deliberately set the book aside and gave him my full and undivided attention, hyper-aware of the way the soft lamplight cast intriguing shadows across his sharp, sculpted features. "I'm listening. I need someone I can trust implicitly in my personal life," he said carefully, his voice carrying the measured weight of a practiced negotiation. "Someone to manage my household, handle my private correspondence, and ensure that my home runs smoothly and efficiently. The position would require absolute discretion and complete loyalty." The words were carefully chosen, almost with legal precision, but I heard what he wasn't explicitly saying. He wasn't simply offering me a job. He was offering me a place, a permanent position in his world, a position that would put me under his powerful protection, seemingly indefinitely. The realization should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a sense of relief so profound it was almost physically painful. "What would that involve exactly?" I asked, though I suspected that the specific details were ultimately less important than the underlying offer of safety and security. "You would live in my penthouse," he said, watching my face intently for any subtle sign of distress or hesitation. "You would have your own private wing, complete privacy whenever you desired it." Your official title would be personal assistant, but your actual responsibilities would be whatever you're comfortable with. The careful way he phrased it told me that he fully understood the inherent vulnerability of my situation, the fact that I might not be entirely ready for the kind of intense intimacy that his offer of protection implied. It was a level of thoughtful consideration that I hadn't necessarily expected from a man who was demonstrably capable of making people disappear without a trace. And it made something warm and unfamiliar unfurl in my chest. And in exchange, you would be under my protection. No one would touch you, threaten you, or cause you any harm without answering directly to me. His voice carried a subtle edge of steel, a quiet but unmistakable warning that reminded me exactly how dangerous he could be when it came to protecting what he considered his. You would be safe, Julia. Completely safe. The promise hung between us, simple and absolute, radiating a sense of unwavering certainty. I thought about my cramped, depressing apartment with its broken lock, about the dead-end job that barely paid enough to cover the monthly rent, about the constant, gnawing fear that had somehow become my new normal. Then I thought about the almost decadent luxury of the past 3 days, the undeniable peace of sleeping soundly without nightmares, the way Mr. Moretti looked at me, as if I were something inherently valuable rather than disposable. What if I want to leave? The question came out smaller than I had intended, carrying the accumulated weight of every bad decision I had made in the past year, a testament to my own flawed judgment. Then you leave. His answer was immediate, unequivocal, delivered with unwavering conviction. With a generous severance package and my personal assurance that you'll never be bothered by anyone from my world again. The genuine sincerity in his voice was startling, almost disarming. Men like Evan made promises that inevitably turned into chains, binding you tighter with each passing day. But there was something fundamentally different about the way Mr. Moretti spoke. A rare quality that strongly suggested his word was his unwavering bond in ways that transcended mere legal contracts. Why me? I asked, though a part of me was honestly afraid of the answer, of what uncomfortable truths it might reveal. You could have anyone. Someone with better qualifications, more relevant experience. Because I've spent the last 8 months watching you handle immense pressure with unwavering grace, he said, his voice soft but undeniably certain. Because you're intelligent enough to see past the superficial surface of things, loyal enough to be trusted with sensitive information, and resilient enough to survive what honestly should have broken you completely. Because when I look at you, I see someone undeniably worth protecting. The words hit me with the force of a physical touch, warm and startling in their unexpected honesty. I had spent so long being told that I was worthless, that I was lucky that anyone would even want me, that hearing myself described as valuable felt like stepping directly into brilliant sunlight after months spent in utter darkness. And because, he continued, his voice dropping to something far more intimate and personal, I find myself caring deeply about your well-being in ways that go far beyond simple professional interest. The surprisingly candid admission hung between us, loaded with implications that I wasn't at all sure I was entirely ready to explore. There was something unmistakable in his eyes that spoke of carefully held desire, of a want that was consciously tempered by a deep respect for my difficult circumstances and the lingering trauma I was still actively processing. I need time to think, I said, though even as the words left my lips, I already knew what my eventual answer would almost certainly be. The stark alternative was returning to a life defined by persistent fear and grinding poverty, of constantly looking over my shoulder and flinching at every unexpected sound. Compared to that bleak prospect, accepting Joseph Moretti's generous offer of protection seemed less like a difficult choice and more like an almost desperate act of salvation. Of course, he rose smoothly, with an almost regal grace, reaching into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored jacket to withdraw a sleek black credit card that he placed deliberately on the table between us. Take all the time you need to consider it. In the meantime, this will cover anything and everything you might require. I stared at the card, fully understanding that it represented far more than just mere purchasing power. It was a powerful demonstration of trust, a bold gesture that unequivocally said he was willing to invest in me, unconditionally, even before I had explicitly agreed to any of his carefully outlined terms. The unwavering faith implicit in that generous offering was both profoundly humbling and undeniably terrifying. "Mr. Moretti." "Joseph," he corrected gently, a hint of amusement flickering in his dark eyes. "I think we're well past formalities at this point, don't you?" The casual use of his first name felt like consciously crossing a significant threshold, openly acknowledging that whatever complex relationship we were actively building clearly existed far outside the traditional boundaries of employer and employee. When I looked up at him again, I saw something new and undeniably compelling in his almost unreadable expression that made my breath catch sharply in my throat. A controlled heat that was undeniable present, a flicker of genuine desire that he was making no real attempt to completely conceal. "Joseph," I repeated, testing the unfamiliar name on my lips, allowing it to linger in the air between us. "What happens if I say yes? Then tomorrow we go to my penthouse, and you see for yourself what your new life could truly look like, what it could actually be." He moved toward the door, then paused briefly, looking back at me with an intensity that made my pulse race uncontrollably. "And Julia, I sincerely hope very much that you do say yes." After he had finally left, I sat alone in the opulent suite, turning the black credit card over and over in my hands, thoughtfully considering the life-altering choice that was now squarely before me. In the almost impossibly short space of a single week, my entire world had inexplicably shifted on its very axis. The man I had feared and loathed was now gone, erased as completely as if he had never actually existed in the first place. The soul-crushing job I had clung to so desperately for basic survival had somehow transformed into something that now vaguely resembled a classic fairy tale. And the powerful boss I had thought I had understood had now revealed himself to be someone far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more intriguing than I had ever previously imagined. I thought about my dear mother, alone in her assisted living facility, with only my sporadic visits to break the monotonous routine of her days. With Joseph's seemingly limitless resources, I could easily ensure that she received the absolute best care available, and I could visit her as often as I liked without constantly worrying about the astronomical cost of travel or the inevitable time away from work. I thought about the dull, constant ache of hunger that I had somehow grown accustomed to over the past several months, the cunning way I had learned to carefully stretch a single, meager meal across 2 long days. In Joseph's extravagant world, such soul-crushing concerns would simply be meaningless, a distant memory. But mostly, I thought about the enticing promise of safety, real and absolute safety, the kind I had almost forgotten even existed. No more compulsively checking the flimsy locks twice before crawling into bed each night. No more pointedly avoiding direct eye contact with menacing strangers on the crowded subway. No more diligently concealing ugly bruises and desperately pretending that everything was perfectly fine. The tantalizing promise of such profound peace was almost too impossibly good to actually be true. When I finally went to bed late that night, I dreamed of gleaming marble floors and soaring floor-to-ceiling windows, of strong, capable hands that offered steadfast protection instead of agonizing pain, of dark, intense eyes that looked at me as if I were something incredibly precious, something to be carefully cherished and valued above all else. For the first time in longer than I could even consciously remember, my troubled dreams were filled with genuine hope instead of overwhelming fear. The very next morning, I resolutely called the number printed on Joseph's crisp business card and spoke the 2 simple words that would irrevocably change everything. "I accept your offer." His immediate response was warm with undisguised satisfaction and something noticeably deeper that sent a shiver of inexplicable heat spiraling directly through my chest. "I'll pick you up promptly at noon. Wear something comfortable. We have a lot to discuss." As I deliberately prepared for the day that would officially mark the true beginning of my entirely new life, I unexpectedly caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was genuinely startled by what I saw staring back at me. The hollow-cheeked, haunted-eyed woman who had been relentlessly staring back at me for the past several months was finally gone, replaced by someone who actually looked almost tentatively hopeful. The lingering bruises had faded to faint yellow shadows, barely even visible beneath the skillfully applied concealer that I no longer needed to apply with visibly trembling hands. I was still undoubtedly damaged, still actively healing from deep wounds that went far deeper than the superficial physical ones that Evan had so casually inflicted. But for the first time in longer than I could even consciously recall, I actually looked like someone who might genuinely have a future worth eagerly looking forward to. When Joseph arrived precisely at noon, impeccably dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that subtly emphasized his broad shoulders and carrying himself with the quiet, understated confidence of a man who clearly owned everything he surveyed, I was ready. Truly ready to resolutely step directly into his fascinating world, genuinely ready to gratefully accept his generous protection, and finally ready to bravely see what kind of extraordinary life was actually possible when someone incredibly powerful finally decided that you were unquestionably worth protecting. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, offering me his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. I gratefully took it, instantly feeling the solid strength and unwavering support beneath the expensive fabric, and actually smiled. "I'm ready." Joseph's sprawling penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a prestigious building on the Upper East Side, a truly breathtaking space that immediately redefined my entire fundamental understanding of both luxury and unadulterated power. The private elevator opened directly into an expansive foyer lavishly lined with gleaming marble that seemed to almost magically glow in the bright afternoon light streaming effortlessly through the massive windows. Valuable art that I readily recognized from glossy museum catalogs adorned the pristine walls, and the air subtly carried the exquisite scent of incredibly expensive flowers and something else altogether, something indefinable and uniquely intangible. The subtle aroma of wealth so ancient and well-established that it had almost become its own distinct atmosphere. "Welcome home," Joseph said quietly, his gaze unwavering, and the simple words sent an almost imperceptible shiver of something entirely new and unfamiliar directly through me, something I didn't necessarily want to immediately examine too closely. He gracefully guided me through a series of impressive rooms that felt decidedly more like exclusive art galleries than comfortable living spaces. A formal dining room with a sprawling table that could easily seat 20 people. A lavish library filled with rare first editions and countless leather-bound volumes in multiple languages. A sophisticated sitting room where every carefully chosen piece of furniture looked like it rightfully belonged in a museum. But it was only when we finally reached the private wing that he deliberately designated as exclusively mine that I finally began to truly understand the sheer scope of what he was so generously offering. My private quarters consisted of an enormous bedroom, easily larger than my entire former apartment, complete with a custom walk-in closet that had already been thoughtfully filled with incredibly expensive clothes in my exact size. The attached bathroom featured a decadent soaking tub expertly carved from a single, solid piece of marble and luxurious fixtures that gleamed like genuine precious metals. Soaring floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking, panoramic view of lush Central Park, and elegant French doors opened onto a secluded private terrace overlooking the glittering city. "How did you know my sizes?" I asked, running my fingers almost reverently over a luxurious silk blouse that probably cost more than I had made in an entire month at my old, dead-end job. "I make it my business to know absolutely everything about the people I genuinely care about," he said simply, his tone suggesting that the almost casual admission was far more significant than it initially appeared. "Do you like it?" Seemed woefully inadequate to describe the complex mix of emotions I was currently feeling. The elegant space was undeniably beautiful beyond simple description, but more importantly than that, it felt undeniably safe. There were sturdy locks on the doors that only I directly controlled, a state-of-the-art security system that would immediately alert us to any potential intrusion. And beyond all of that, the constant protection of a powerful man whose profound influence I was honestly only beginning to fully comprehend. "It's perfect," I said sincerely, and I honestly meant it. "But I still don't fully understand why you're doing all of this." "Don't you?" He moved closer, deliberately invading my personal space. Close enough that I could fully smell his intoxicating cologne and clearly see the flecks of gold glittering in his mesmerizing dark eyes. "Julia, I've been carefully watching you for 8 long months. Diligently watching you arrive early each morning and consistently stay late each evening. Attentively watching you gracefully handle impossible deadlines with unbelievable finesse. Thoughtfully watching you skillfully hide deep pain that honestly should have been unbearable." His voice dropped to something far more intimate, and I felt heat begin to build unexpectedly in places that had been cold for far too long. "I've been watching you, and constantly thinking about what it would be like to simply take that pain completely away, To finally give you everything you truly deserve instead of everything you've been unfairly forced to merely accept. The intense words hit me with the undeniable force of a physical touch, and I realized that what I was clearly seeing in his unwavering expression wasn't just ingrained protective instinct or even simple, straightforward desire. It was something significantly deeper, something that spoke of genuine, heartfelt care meticulously masked as a mere business arrangement. "Joseph, I know this is complicated," he continued, gently reaching out to carefully brush a stray strand of hair away from my face with delicate fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "I know you're still actively healing, still diligently processing everything that has happened. I'm honestly not asking for anything that you're genuinely not ready to give." "Then what are you actually asking for?" "Time," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. "Time for you to properly heal. Time for you to clearly see that not all men are inherently like him. Time for you to fully understand that you undeniably deserve to be cherished and valued instead of needlessly hurt." The raw honesty in his voice was absolutely devastating, and I found myself instinctively leaning into his gentle touch without conscious thought. It had been so long since someone had touched me with genuine gentleness, since physical contact had actually meant comfort instead of constant pain, that the simple brush of his trembling fingers against my sensitive skin sent unexpected warmth shooting through my entire body. What if I'm too damaged? The loaded question unexpectedly slipped out before I could consciously stop it, carrying the immense weight of months of intense fear and debilitating self-doubt. What if what he did to me irreparably broke something that can't actually be fixed? The fleeting flash of anger that unexpectedly crossed Joseph's normally composed features was both swift and undeniably deadly, but I immediately realized that it wasn't actually directed at me. "He didn't break you," he said fiercely, his voice laced with barely contained rage. "He hurt you, he terrorized you, he tried to make you feel smaller than you are. But you're still undeniably here, still actively fighting, still undeniably strong enough to bravely walk away from everything that was even remotely familiar because you instinctively knew that you deserved so much better. That's not broken, Julia. That's undeniably courage." The intensely personal words hit me with the force of pure absolution, almost magically washing away months of intense shame and relentless self-recrimination. For the first time since Evan's horrific abuse had actually begun, I felt like something other than a helpless victim, like a true survivor, like someone who had truly endured and somehow emerged with her innermost core still miraculously intact. "I care deeply about you," Joseph continued softly, his voice both gentle and undeniably certain. "More than is probably wise, more than is most certainly professional. I genuinely want to protect you, yes, but I also genuinely want to know you. I genuinely want to learn what actually makes you laugh, what you passionately dream about, what you truly want from a fulfilling life that's finally truly your own to freely live." The surprisingly vulnerable confession hung between us, unexpectedly honest in a way that almost completely took my breath away. I intensely studied his handsome face, carefully looking for any subtle signs of the manipulation I had unfortunately learned to readily recognize, the almost imperceptible pressure that had been Evan's twisted specialty. But all I could see was unwavering sincerity, profound patience, and a controlled heat that was undeniably there. It was controlled but undeniably real. "I honestly don't know how to navigate this," I confessed, gesturing between the two of us, trying to capture the complexity of what he was laying out for me. "I don't know how to trust someone who holds power over me. How do I believe that protection doesn't always come with strings attached?" "Then let me show you how it can be different," he responded, taking my hands into his with a gentleness that felt like a balm. "Let me prove to you that there's a massive difference between strength that shields and strength that demolishes. Let me demonstrate that genuinely caring for someone means honoring their choices, not obliterating them." My gaze dropped to our joined hands. I couldn't help but notice how his hands completely dwarfed mine, the rough calluses hinting at a past filled with more than just high-powered boardroom negotiations. The careful, almost reverent way he held me, as if I was a precious, fragile thing. When I finally met his gaze again, there was a look in his eyes that made my heart pound in my chest. It wasn't fear, not at all, but something closer to anticipation. "What exactly would that look like in practice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, the words catching in my throat. Dinners together when you're craving company and connection. Space and solitude when you need to recharge and be alone with your thoughts. Deep conversations about books and art and anything else that sparks your interest. Time to heal, to mend the broken pieces. Time to rediscover the person you truly are, the one who isn't constantly living in fear. As he spoke, his thumbs traced small, gentle circles across my knuckles, sending spirals of warmth radiating up my arms. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, something more. The promise hanging in those words made my breath hitch in my throat. But there was absolutely no pressure in his voice, no expectation hanging in the air other than what I was willing to offer freely. It was an offer laid out without ultimatums, a vision of the future sketched in possibilities rather than rigid demands. The people who work for you, I began, thinking of the men who had gathered information about Evan with such cold efficiency. They know what happened to him. They know that a problem was dealt with, Joseph corrected carefully, choosing his words with precision. They don't ask any questions about the methods used, and they certainly don't discuss business outside these walls. And if someone else threatens me? If there are unforeseen consequences to what you did? His expression shifted, hardening into something almost predatory, a glimpse of the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. Then they'll quickly learn why it was a monumental mistake to involve themselves in my affairs. The quiet menace in his voice really should have sent shivers of fear down my spine. But instead, it ignited a thrill, a strange sense of excitement that I didn't particularly want to examine too closely at that moment. There was a certain kind of safety in Joseph's raw strength. A strange sense of security in knowing he was willing to resort to violence to protect the things, or the people that he truly cared about. I do have one condition, I stated, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. Name it. Complete and utter honesty between us. No lies, no omissions, no protecting me from truths that you think I can't handle. I held his intense gaze steadily, letting him see the unwavering resolve in my expression. I've already lived through a lifetime of deception and manipulation. If we're really going to do this, if we're going to attempt to build something real here, I need to know that what you tell me is the unvarnished truth. Something that looked suspiciously like respect flickered across his features. Agreed. Complete honesty, even when the truth is uncomfortable, even when it's difficult to say. Then, yes, I replied, the word coming out stronger, more confidently than I had anticipated. Yes to time. Yes to healing. Yes to exploring what this could potentially become. The genuine smile that spread across his face completely transformed his entire appearance, softening the harsh, sharp edges of his features and revealing something surprisingly boyish and vulnerable beneath the sophisticated exterior. When he leaned down to press a gentle, feather-light kiss to my forehead, I felt something deep inside me that had been frozen solid for months finally begin to thaw, like ice cracking under the warmth of the sun. Welcome to your new life, Julia, he murmured softly against my skin. I promise you, you won't ever regret this decision. 2 months drifted by in what genuinely felt like a luxurious, carefully orchestrated dream of a courtship. Joseph was true to his word in every way that truly mattered. I had complete freedom within the confines of the penthouse, access to resources that I never could have imagined in my wildest dreams, and most importantly, the kind of profound safety that actually allowed me to sleep soundly through the entire night without constantly waking up in a cold sweat, gripped by fear. He was incredibly patient with my healing process, deeply respectful of my boundaries, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, I began to remember what it actually felt like to be cherished, to be truly valued, rather than simply tolerated. We settled into a comfortable routine that felt surprisingly natural. Breakfast together whenever our chaotic schedules aligned, engaging in conversations about everything from classic literature to current politics to the mind-boggling complexities of running a vast business empire that often straddled the precarious line between what was legal and what definitely wasn't. He slowly, carefully, introduced me to his world, always giving me the option to retreat, to back away, if the sheer magnitude of his power became overwhelming. It was during one of these seemingly ordinary conversations over dinner in the penthouse's elegant dining room that the carefully constructed piece of our arrangement faced its very first real, significant test. There's something you need to know, Joseph began, setting down his wine glass with an unusual air of deliberation. Something that might significantly change how you feel about staying here with me. The sudden seriousness in his tone instantly made my stomach clench with anxiety, but I had learned to trust his promise of honesty, even when the truth was likely to be difficult, maybe even painful to hear. Tell me. Victor coughed. The mere name carried a heavy weight, a palpable sense of menace, and I saw something dark and dangerous flicker across Joseph's features. He was Evan's supplier, the man who provided him with the drugs that fueled his violent outbursts, that made his inherent darkness even worse. When Evan disappeared, Victor lost a very significant source of income. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications of what he was saying became crystal clear. He knows what happened. He suspects, Joseph corrected, still choosing his words with extreme care. And he's decided that you represent a potentially lucrative opportunity to recoup his substantial losses. The words hit me like a bucket of ice water, instantly bringing back that familiar, sickening taste of fear that I had almost managed to forget. What kind of opportunity? He believes that someone who matters to me would be worth a considerable ransom. Joseph's voice was dangerously quiet, but I could feel the barely controlled fury building beneath his carefully composed exterior. He's already made inquiries about your daily schedule, your security arrangements, your vulnerabilities, anything he can use against us. I set down my fork, my hands visibly shaking. The elegant meal suddenly tasted like ashes in my mouth. So, I'm a target now because of my association with you? Yes, he replied, making no attempt to soften the harsh truth. And I was actually grateful for his unwavering honesty, even as it completely terrified me. But Julia, you absolutely need to understand something. This isn't your fault in any way, shape, or form, and it's definitely not something you have to face alone. What are my options? I asked, even though I already suspected that I knew the answer. You could leave, he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. I could arrange for you to disappear completely. Brand new identity, new location, enough money to start over anywhere in the world that you choose. Victor would have absolutely no way to ever find you, and you'd be completely free to build whatever kind of life you wanted for yourself. The offer was unbelievably generous, but I still caught the carefully controlled pain that flickered in his eyes, the way his hands tightened almost imperceptibly around his wine glass. The mere thought of leaving him, of walking away from the newfound safety and genuine care that I had found in his world, sent a sharp spike of panic through me, and it had absolutely nothing to do with any external threats. And the other option? You stay. His eyes locked with mine, dark, intense, and unwavering. You let me protect you the way I should have protected you from the very beginning. You trust that my resources, my people, my unwavering willingness to do whatever is absolutely necessary will be enough to keep you safe. And Victor, the chilling smile that slowly spread across Joseph's features was cold and utterly predatory. Victor becomes a cautionary tale, a stark reminder about the potentially devastating consequences of threatening something that rightfully belongs to me. The possessive note in his voice really should have alarmed me, should have immediately reminded me of Evan's obsessive jealousy and controlling nature. But there was something fundamentally different about the way Joseph claimed me, not as property to be owned and controlled, but as something incredibly precious that needed to be protected at all costs. That distinction mattered more than I could possibly express in words. If I stay, if I let you handle this threat, what exactly does that make me? I asked, finally voicing the fear that had been steadily growing in my chest. Someone who simply hides behind your violence while you conveniently eliminate all of my problems? It makes you someone smart enough to accept protection when it's genuinely offered, he replied firmly, his voice brooking no argument. Someone brave enough to choose safety over a false sense of independence. Someone who understands that sometimes the only way to truly stop a predator is to have someone even more dangerous standing in your corner. The cold logic was undeniable, but I still couldn't completely shake the nagging feeling that accepting his protection, yet again, would fundamentally change our rapidly evolving relationship, would shift the balance of power between us in ways that simply couldn't be undone. I need to ask you something, I said, meeting his intense gaze steadily, refusing to back down. And I really need you to be completely honest with me, always. If I choose to stay here, If I let you eliminate this threat, will you still see me as someone intrinsically worth protecting? Or will I just become another responsibility, another possession to be managed and controlled? The heavy question hung in the air between us, carrying the full weight of every deeply ingrained fear I had ever harbored about powerful men and the women who inevitably depended on them. I watched Joseph's face with intense scrutiny, looking for even the slightest sign of the patronizing dismissal that I had unfortunately learned to recognize all too well over the years. Instead, I saw something that looked suspiciously like genuine admiration. Julia, the very fact that you can even ask that question, that you're still thinking independently, even when you're understandably afraid, is exactly why you are so incredibly worth protecting. You're not asking me to think for you or to make all of your important decisions. You're asking me to simply stand beside you while you face a terrible threat that no one should ever have to face alone. The distinction was undeniably subtle but absolutely crucial, and I felt something deep inside me finally settle at his heartfelt words. This wasn't about meekly giving up my own agency. It was about consciously choosing to share the immense burden with someone who was undoubtedly strong enough to carry it alongside me. There's something else, I added, surprised by my own newfound boldness. Something else that I really need you to know before I can fully make this incredibly important decision. Tell me, I'm falling in love with you. The words came out far quieter than I had intended, but they carried an undeniable certainty, a conviction that resonated deep within my soul. Not simply because you saved me from a terrible situation, not just because you're actively protecting me right now, but because of the kind of man you are when you think that no one is watching. Because you quietly bring me coffee in the mornings and you always remember that I like to spend my afternoons reading by the window in the living room. Because you actually listen when I talk about my mother and you never, ever make me feel even remotely guilty for wanting to visit her more often. I took a deep breath, gathering all of my courage for the rest of it. If I stay here, if I let you handle Victor and this whole mess, it won't be because I'm secretly afraid to leave, to try to build a life on my own. It will be because I am actively choosing to try to build a life with you, whatever that ultimately looks like. The effect of my honest confession was both immediate and incredibly powerful. I watched as Joseph's carefully controlled composure finally cracked, revealing something raw and incredibly vulnerable lurking just beneath the surface. When he reached across the table to take my trembling hands in his own fingers were shaking ever so slightly. "Julia," he said, his voice unusually rough with barely contained emotion. "I've been completely in love with you since the very first day. Since the day you bravely told me that you were fine, when it was painfully obvious to everyone in the room that you were quietly breaking apart inside. I've been constantly thinking about what it would truly mean to have you in my life. Really, truly in my life. Not just as someone that I feel compelled to protect, but as someone that I am actively building a future with." His heartfelt confession sent a rush of warmth flooding through me, finally washing away the very last of my lingering fears about his underlying motives. When he stood up and quickly moved around the table to cup my face gently in his hands, I leaned into his comforting touch without even a moment's hesitation. "If you stay," he murmured softly, his thumbs tracing feather-light paths across my cheekbones, "it won't just be about Victor. There will always be potential threats. There will always be people who wrongly think that they can use you to somehow get to me. Are you genuinely prepared for that reality? Are you honestly prepared to love someone who inevitably comes with their own set of rather significant complications? Are you prepared to love someone who comes with her own complications?" I countered, thinking of my difficult mother, my troubled past, the lingering wounds that would undoubtedly take a significant amount of time to fully heal. "I am absolutely prepared to love you exactly as you are," he said simply, his gaze unflinching. Complications and all. When he finally kissed me, it was nothing at all like the brutal, possessive acts I had unfortunately come to expect from the men in my past who had claimed to care about me. It was gentle, reverent, a promise made with lips and breath that spoke of partnership and mutual respect rather than ownership and control. When we finally broke apart, I knew, deep in my heart, that whatever choice I ultimately made would be mine alone, made with clear eyes and a complete understanding of all the potential consequences. "Then I stay," I said, surprised by just how steady my voice actually sounded. I consciously choose this life, this love, this potential future that we can actively build together, side by side. The brilliant smile that spread across his face was absolutely radiant, completely transforming him from the undeniably dangerous man who could, and undoubtedly had, made people simply disappear into someone who suddenly looked almost young with sheer, unadulterated happiness. And Victor learns exactly why it was such a colossal mistake to threaten your family. I stated, the word family now carrying a profound new weight and deeper meaning. Because that's what I am now. Isn't it? Family? Yes, he replied, pulling me into his arms with seemingly infinite tenderness. Your family, your home, your everything. As he held me tightly against his broad chest, I could clearly hear the steady, reassuring rhythm of his strong heartbeat, feel the solid, unwavering strength of his protective embrace, and for the very first time in my entire life, I finally understood what it truly meant to feel genuinely safe. Not just protected from external threats and potential harm, but genuinely cherished for exactly who I was, valued for my inherent strength rather than being controlled because of my perceived vulnerabilities. I knew that the road ahead wouldn't necessarily be simple or easy. Loving a man like Joseph inevitably meant accepting the ever-present shadows that unfortunately came with his blinding light. Understanding that our shared happiness would always have to be defended with methods that often existed far outside the boundaries of conventional morality. But as I stood there in his secure arms, surrounded by unimaginable luxury and a profound sense of unwavering safety and unconditional love, I finally knew, with absolute certainty, that I had finally found exactly where I truly belonged. I love you, I whispered softly against his chest, and I instantly felt him tighten his strong arms protectively around me. I love you too, he murmured into my hair. Always and completely. Far off in the distance, the city glittered like a promising beacon of future possibilities. But at that moment, all that truly mattered was this exact moment, this conscious choice, this extraordinary man who had shown me that sometimes true salvation came in the most unexpected forms. I had consciously chosen love over fear, partnership over isolating solitude.